William Pickering. My great-grandfather was born in Yorkshire, England in 1798. He didn't know what to do being a civil engineer. That's what he graduated as. And so he decided to come to America. And he got on a tramp steamer, had a few dollars, and he got over to the United States. He ended up settling in Illinois. And he started a little business there. He got on a farm, got into the Illinois legislature, met a gal, got married, had 5 sons. During that time, he became very acquainted with Abe Lincoln because he was in the Illinois state legislature. And he and Lincoln used to visit back and forth. And so when he nominated Abe Lincoln for President of the United States, and of course, as you all know, Lincoln became President of the United States, he then turned around and offered my great-grandfather United States Ambassador back to England, or Washington Territorial Governor. He took Washington Territory, it wasn't a state, it was just a territory, governorship. He came out here on a train, settled in Snoqualmie, right where the falls are. He came to Issaquah from Snoqualmie, where he had a little house and run his business as governor, to Issaquah in 1865. He thought this was the most beautiful valley he'd ever seen in his life. It was not Issaquah, it was called Squak Valley. He settled here in Squak Valley, built a little house, a little barn, and started a farm because he had acquired through school property for $1.50 an acre, 160 acres. His son, William Jr., who was here at that time, acquired under homesteading another 160 acres, so it made a total of 320 acres they had. And he met a lady by the name of Sevilla that had just came out from Missouri on a train and came to Issaquah, or Squak Valley, and the two met and they got married and had 3 little boys, William, Royal, and Ernest. And they were in the process of building this barn, and my grandfather, who was my grandfather then, William Jr., died at the age of 58. So that left my grandma and 3 little boys with to manage that 320 acres and all that farm, and they had one heck of a time. She sold the section and a half of Snoqualmie Falls and the town of Snoqualmie for $2,500, and took that money, and that's what they used to put into the barn. It isn't what people see today, the whole barn. It's just the big hay barn. That's the part, because they had about 25 cows in there. They had horses on one side. They had feed and hay all down the middle, and that's where they farmed for many, many years. And then in 1904, that's when the rest of the whole dairy barn was built.
My grandfather, Henry Bergsma, he worked as a milker. He rented some farms. I worked up on the Issaquah-Hobart Road on what was the Hart Farm in Milt for a time. Then they rented some property, which was the Prentice Place, which became our farm in later years. My parents, William and Esther Bergsma, and my Uncle Jack, my dad's brother, and his wife, Ida Mae. We lived adjacent on 2 pieces of property. There were actually 3 lots. What is now Tibbetts Creek ran all the way across, all the way down to Lake Sammamish. It went all the way out to Highway 10, and there were some that were 10-acre fields. And then adjacent to that, towards Goods Corner, was property owned by the Pickerings.
It was the biggest dairy farm in the valley and the biggest dairy all around. My dad and his 2 brothers, William and Ernest, all 3 milkers, all the milking was done by hand. They were milking probably 60-some cows. Well, there was 4 of us boys and 1 cousin, but it was mainly my brother Wilbur and I. We were the 2 oldest, so we got involved in a lot of the farming at that time.
There was the milk house, which was just to the north of that. And later on, it was expanded. They had a little room built on the porch where they would run the milk through the separator. When they would milk the cows, they would carry these 10-gallon cans. I think my father and my husband could carry like 4 of these cans. I don't know how many 100 pounds they would weigh, but they could carry them up, pour the milk over this refrigerated cooler. From there, it would be put in a big vat, a covered stainless steel vat. There was a steam boiler, but there was 3 partitions where you would cleanse and clean your milk bottles.
Prior to World War II, we milked all by hand. World War II come along and we got my two other brothers that stayed on the farm. They got milking machines. So when I came back from the service after 4 years, I started right in and we were milking up about 90 to 100 cows then. Milk was all went over a cooler, went into 10-gallon cans, and we set them in a water tank in the dairy. And then the milk truck, Costagno Brothers milk truck, they used to come around in the morning. We'd set the cans out on the platform and they'd pick them up and take them to Dairy Gold or into Seattle to other dairies, and that's where the milk went. Issaquah Creamy, which was now Dairy Gold.
There was a pasteurizing machine, and later on they had a homogenizing machine. We had a refrigerated room where once the milk was bottled and put into the glass bottles, and they were put into these cases. The cases were stacked on dollies and they were wheeled into the refrigerated room to stay cool for preparation to deliver to the milk customers the next day. When my dad and my uncle took it over, it became Bergsma Brothers, but it was Issaquah Valley Dairy, Bergsma Brothers. As the business expanded, we had two drivers, two trucks, and Jack had a couple of routes and my dad had a couple of routes. So we were delivering milk 6 days a week.
There was visitors here all the time. There's always somebody coming in. Lots of city people would come out and see what a farm was like. The Helen Bush Private Girls School, they came out one day, I think about 25 girls with a couple of teachers, to see what a farm was like. And they came through the barn to see how the milking went on and so forth. I was in the barn milking, and we had a ramp out in back where we took and dumped all the manure with a wheelbarrow every morning. And that builds up about 4 feet deep before we haul it out in the spring. Gets covered with kind of dirt and grass. Unknown to me, these girls were playing tag. And they run up the ramp, and about 6 of them jumped in. They thought it was a mound of dirt. And all of a sudden I heard all this screaming. And God, they come and got me, and I went out. Here's about 6 girls armpit deep in the middle of this manure pile. And I had to get down underneath there and get them all out and take them to my mom's house. And I had a sister, and they had to give them all clothes. And years later, some of these girls, when they were mothers, came out and said they'd never forget their first day on the farm. My dad worked me, and I worked my kids. The girls drove tractors, they raised calves. And it's just a wonderful place for kids. Had their own horses. Joe Scalia, the great photographer from Seattle Times, came out and run a whole series of us on the haying in the farm. And he took a picture of my daughter driving a tractor with a hay wagon loaded with bales of hay with all the high school kids on it.
We went as far as Hobart Road and to Preston, Upper Preston area, Pine Lake, down East Lake Sammamish, down West Lake Sammamish, as far as Mint Grove at least on the east side, and way past Vasa Park on the west side, delivering milk to various people. There were 2 routes in Issaquah, which my dad pretty much maintained, one side of town or the other, and closer in areas.
I had favorite cows, yep, had some I liked very well, some I didn't like at all. Some were very gentle, and some kicked the hell out of you.
Bob, my husband, worked on the farm from when he was in the 8th grade on. He roomed and boarded with Jack and Ida May. And then Bob and I ended up getting together. We were practically grew up together, and we got married in 1957. And then he continued to work on the farm. And then in 1959, he had a chance to go to work for Dairy Gold, and I was working at the Boeing company at that time. And so he started to work at Dairy Gold, and I think this kind of threw everybody for a shock for a little bit. I don't think that Aunt Ida necessarily really enjoyed the cow business because it was so confining to their time. My grandfather suggested that he would loan us some money, Bob and I, to buy out Uncle Jack's half of the dairy milk routes. And so Bob left Dairy Gold and took him up on it. We ended up being a partner with my father and my mother.
Regulations, typically like everything else. I mean, you got health department got involved in it more and more. There was a lot of things that we couldn't do that we used to be able to do. We got the pipeline milker and got away from the cans. You couldn't have the cows just go to the bathroom in the barn anymore. They could, but you had to wash it down with a hose, go into a big tank outside. I mean, everything changed.
My grandfather sold the farm to George Rowley Enterprises. From 62 to 69, at least, we were renting the property from George Rowley. My grandfather sold the land, most of the land on the flat. His reason being, well, you know, he had 9 children and he was getting up in years. We had a farm auction of the equipment, the cows, all these things that were on the farm that we were not going to be using anymore. My dad and my husband continued to purchase milk from Dairygold Farms. They would truck it down there, and we still continued operating our milk routes, but we were considered independent jobbers. Jobbers was the term. And we then continued distributing Dairygold milk to our regular customers. My father was really incensed that he sold the land too cheaply to George Rowley. And I remember my grandfather saying, but, you know, I mean, sure, the land may be worth more, but then you'd get more, have to pay more in taxes and whatever. 1969, I think we totally sold the milk route business, sold the milk routes to Dairygold, and that's when Bob went back to work for Dairygold, and he chose to go into the Rainer Avenue plant where he worked in the processing area there. And my father at that time went to work for King County road crew, and he became a flagman for many years. My grandfather retained ownership, I think there was 34 to 38 acres on the hill above the farm, and that's still in trust right now, and hopefully it'll be sold or developed or something eventually. The new Issaquah Garden Hilton Hotel is on what was the Bergsma farm.